Do you know that instant, bone-deep chill when a place feels off? Like the walls themselves are holding a secret they don't want you to know? That's exactly how I felt the moment I stepped into the cabin. My name's Claire, and I've never been the type to scare easily. I've lived alone in the city for years, walked through dark alleys, taken midnight trains, but this was different. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air seemed heavier, like the walls were closing in on us. I glanced at Maya, my best friend, hoping to see her usual skeptical smirk, but her face was pale. She felt it too. The host, Mr. Grayson, stood behind us, his presence looming even in silence. "It's perfect, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth but empty, like he was reading lines from a script. My eyes landed on the worn floorboards beneath my feet, faint scratches in the wood running in all directions, almost like claw marks. I laughed nervously to break the tension. "Perfect," I said, trying to convince myself. After all, this was supposed to be an escape. A quiet, cozy retreat to finish my art and clear my head. But why did it feel like the house was waiting for something? If you think this is just paranoia, let me tell you, it wasn't. Something was wrong with that house. I didn't know it then, but it was watching me. It had been watching for a long time. Keep listening, and I'll tell you how we ended up there. More importantly, I'll reveal what we found, and why you should think twice before you ever rent a place like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. And if you're ready for more chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe and join me on this journey. It started small, almost laughably so. After Mr. Grayson left, Maya and I explored the cabin. The sunlight streaming through the wide windows gave it a deceptively warm glow, highlighting the rustic charm. There were antique picture frames on the walls, a fireplace with logs neatly stacked beside it, and bookshelves stuffed with old paperbacks and knickknacks. It was the kind of place you'd see in a postcard. But then Maya noticed the scratches. At first, I thought they were just wear and tear, the kind you'd expect in a house this old. "Look at this," she said, kneeling near the base of the stairs. The marks were deeper here, almost deliberate, like something had been clawing at the wood. "Maybe a dog," I suggested, though my voice betrayed the doubt I already felt. A dog's claws wouldn't have left marks that jagged. They were too long, too desperate. Maya wasn't convinced either. "A big dog," she muttered, brushing her fingers over the grooves. We moved on, forcing ourselves to laugh it off. But the oddities kept stacking up. The light bulbs in the hallway flickered no matter how many times I twisted them tighter. The clocks were all set to different times, none of them accurate. And then there was the basement door. It was locked, of course. That in itself wasn't unusual. But what was strange was the keyhole. I crouched down to peer inside, half expecting to see nothing but darkness. Instead, I saw movement. Something fluttered just beyond the threshold. My heart stuttered. Maya nudged me, breaking my trance. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied, standing up too quickly. "Probably just a draft." But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't a draft, and it wasn't nothing. Something was behind that door, and it wanted us to know it. That first night, the house came alive. It started with the noises, soft at first, just the kind you'd blame on an old building settling into the cold night air. But then they grew. A steady creaking, like footsteps pacing back and forth above us. Except we were on the top floor. Maya heard it too. She looked at me from across the room, her eyes wide, lips pressed tight to keep from speaking the obvious. "It's just the wind," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. But the pacing didn't stop. It circled slowly, deliberately, as though something, or someone, was testing the space. At one point, Maya grabbed her phone to record it, but when she hit play, all we heard was static. We barely slept, and when the morning light finally streamed through the windows, It felt like we'd survived a siege. Yet the unease didn't leave with the night. In the daylight, the house felt even more wrong. We found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the kitchen, long, uneven prints that ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished. Maya's unease turned to frustration. "This is ridiculous," she said, grabbing her bag. "We should just leave." I wanted to agree, but something kept me there, a pull I couldn't explain. "One more night," I told her. "Just one more. I need to figure this out." She stared at me like I was insane, and maybe I was. But there was something about the house, about the locked door in the basement, about the pacing footsteps in the dark that demanded answers. By the time the second night fell, we knew we weren't alone. The second night was worse. It wasn't just the pacing anymore. Around midnight, the sound of muffled whispers began, like a conversation we couldn't quite make out. The words were low and rhythmic, sometimes rising just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It came from the basement door. Maya refused to stay upstairs. "I'm not sleeping in this house while someone's clearly down there," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and made her way to the locked door. I hesitated. The smart thing would have been to leave right then, but something about the whispers kept me rooted. They weren't just noise. They felt purposeful, like they were meant for us. Maya banged on the door with the poker. "Who's in there?" she shouted. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. Then, as if in response, the lock clicked. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a taunt. She looked at me. "Did you see that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. Maybe it's just old, but we both knew better. Slowly, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The air that escaped was heavy and damp, carrying a metallic smell that turned my stomach. We stepped inside, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. What we saw made my breath catch. The walls were lined with pictures, old, yellowing photos of people. Couples, families, travelers like us, all smiling, their faces frozen in joy. But beneath each picture was a single word scrawled in a dark, oily substance: offering. In the corner of the room stood a small altar, draped in what looked like animal hides and surrounded by melted candles. The symbols carved into the wood were the same as the ones I'd seen around the house. "What the hell is this?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the whispers returned, louder this time, and all around us. The basement door slammed shut behind us, sealing us inside. We froze as the door slammed shut, the whispers growing louder, swelling into a suffocating hum that filled every corner of the basement. The flashlight flickered in Maya's shaking hand, casting frantic shadows that seemed to move on their own. "This isn't happening," she muttered, backing toward the door, the poker clutched tightly in her other hand. But I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the altar, to the symbols carved so deep they seemed to pulse, almost alive. Something about them felt familiar, like I'd seen them before. But where? And then we heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, each creak of the old wood slicing through the hum like a knife. "Mr. Grayson," his voice called out, calm but with an edge of something darker. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said, his tone dripping with quiet menace. "Stay back," Maya yelled, pointing the flashlight toward the door. But it wasn't just him anymore. The shadows seemed to gather around him, thick and unnatural, stretching and twisting as he stepped into view. His face was different now, still smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. "I told you," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "This house is sacred. It chooses who stays and who doesn't leave." The symbols on the altar began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, casting an eerie red light that filled the room. The pictures on the walls seemed to warp, the smiling faces twisting into screams. Maya grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here," she said, panic breaking her voice. But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed or slammed against it, it stayed firm, as if the house itself wouldn't let us go. And then I saw it. A figure in the corner of the room. It wasn't human, its shape flickering like static on a broken TV, its hollow eyes locked on me. This wasn't just a house, it was a trap. And we were the next offering. The figure in the corner began to move, its distorted form sliding closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices layered atop one another, each filled with desperation and rage. Maya swung the iron poker wildly, her flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away, leaving us bathed in the pulsing red glow of the symbols. "Claire!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Do something!" I stumbled toward the altar, drawn to the carvings that now burned like fire etched into the wood. The whispers seemed to center on it, growing louder as I reached out. My fingers brushed against the surface, and a shock of icy pain shot up my arm. Visions slammed into my mind. Faces of the trapped, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched into silent screams. They were begging for release. "This is the key," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "We have to destroy it." Maya didn't hesitate. She swung the poker with all her strength, splintering the edge of the altar. The screams grew deafening, the room shaking violently, as if the house itself was fighting back. The figure lashed out, its shadowy form expanding, clawing at us with hands that weren't hands, cold and sharp as ice. I grabbed a candle and held it to the altar's height covering, the flame catching almost instantly. The fire roared, consuming the symbols and spreading quickly across the wood. Mr. Grayson's voice joined the screams now, a guttural, inhuman wail. "You don't know what you've done," he bellowed, his form flickering between human and something far darker. "You've doomed us all." But I didn't stop. The fire climbed higher, the room filling with smoke and ash. The shadowy figure recoiled, its form disintegrating with each crackle of flame. The pictures on the walls burned away, their anguished faces fading into nothingness. Finally, with one last shudder, the house let out a groan, the walls splitting, the floor beneath us buckling. I grabbed Maya's hand, and together we charged at the basement door. This time, it flew open, spilling us into the cold night air. We didn't look back as the house collapsed behind us, the flames consuming it entirely. But even as we ran, I could still hear the whispers, faint and lingering, as if the house wasn't quite done with us yet. The night was silent as we stood outside, gasping for breath, the icy air biting at our skin. Behind us, the house burned furiously, the flames reaching high into the sky. It should have felt like a victory, but all I felt was dread. The whispers were gone, but something still lingered, a heaviness, like the house had left its mark on us. Maya collapsed onto the gravel, her hands trembling as she stared at the smoldering ruins. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than to me. But I couldn't answer. Deep down, I wasn't sure it was. We didn't wait for the fire to die out. As soon as we could stand, we made our way to the car. The engine sputtered to life, and we tore down the winding road, the glow of the flames fading in the rearview mirror. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Maya stared straight ahead, her face pale and drawn, while I clutched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind raced, replaying everything we'd seen, the altar, the symbols, Mr. Grayson's face twisting into something inhuman. And those pictures, the smiling faces of people who'd come before us, now nothing but ashes. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't know how to answer. I thought about the house, about the feeling of being watched, about the figure in the basement that didn't belong to this world. The house was gone, yes, but its memory, its grip, it wasn't so easily destroyed. When we reached town, we didn't go to the police. What could we even say? Who would believe us? Instead, we drove until the sun rose, until the town was nothing but a distant memory. Weeks later, I tried to go back to my normal life. I painted, hoping to lose myself in my work. But the canvases took on a life of their own. Dark, violent images of shadowy figures and burning houses. It was as though the house was still inside me, whispering through the brushstrokes. One day, I received a notification on my phone, an email from the same platform where I'd found the Airbnb. Looking for a secluded getaway? It read, complete with a link to a new listing. The house in the photo looked eerily familiar, down to the weathered wood and sprawling trees. I deleted the email, but my hand shook as I did. I knew, in my gut, that it wasn't over. It never would be. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're brave enough, stick around. I've got more stories like this coming your way. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone, even when you knew you were? That eerie sensation of being watched? Well, that's exactly what happened to me, and I'll never forget it. This isn't just another ghost story or a creepy coincidence. What I'm about to share with you actually happened, and it still gives me chills just thinking about it. I should have seen the signs from the start. The moment I stepped into the house, there was something off. A heavy, suffocating energy, like the walls themselves were alive, quietly observing me. But I ignored it. Why wouldn't I? It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a chance to unplug and unwind in a quiet, charming Airbnb tucked away in the woods. Instead, I stumbled into a waking nightmare. Stay with me until the end of this story, and I promise it'll make you think twice about where you choose to stay on your next trip. Trust me, this isn't just a story, it's a warning. So, there I was, scrolling through Airbnb late one night, searching for something peaceful and isolated. That's when I found it. A picturesque little cottage surrounded by towering trees and glowing with warm, golden light. The photos made it look like something out of a fairy tale. It had 5-star reviews, a friendly host who left thoughtful touches for guests, and the kind of vibe that made you want to pack your bags immediately. I booked it without a second thought. But the moment I arrived, everything started to feel wrong. The drive was long, but uneventful. Winding roads cut through dense woods, and the sun began dipping below the horizon as I neared the house. That's when I first felt it. This strange unease creeping into my chest. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as nerves or excitement. But by the time I pulled up to the driveway, it had taken root, twisting in my gut like a bad premonition. The house itself was just as advertised. A quaint, 2-story cottage with flower boxes under the windows and soft golden lights spilling onto the porch. It looked welcoming, normal, yet something about it felt too perfect, like a set built for a show instead of a real home. When I stepped inside, the air hit me like a wall, thick and stale, despite the house being spotlessly clean. A handwritten welcome note sat on the kitchen counter, next to a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Welcome, enjoy your stay," it read, signed with a flourish. It should have made me feel at ease, but instead it felt wrong. Like whoever wrote it wasn't just being polite, they were trying too hard. As I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The living room was cozy, with mismatched furniture and an old grandfather clock ticking loudly in the corner. A dining table sat under a chandelier that swayed slightly, even though no windows were open. Upstairs, the bedroom was simple, but the mirror hanging across from the bed made me uneasy. Every time I caught my reflection, I felt like I was being examined, judged even. I tried to brush it off. It's just an old house, I told myself, unpacking my bag. Of course it's going to creak and feel a little eerie, but by the time night fell, that excuse didn't hold up anymore. That first night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds, soft footsteps across the hardwood floors, the creak of a door hinge, and whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the product of an overactive mind in a strange place. But then I realized they were real. Low and hushed, the whispers seemed to come from just outside my door. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't words exactly, just murmurs, like a one-sided conversation that I wasn't supposed to interrupt. Finally, I mustered the courage to check. I swung the door open, heart pounding, only to be met with silence. No one was there. But the air felt heavier now, oppressive, like something unseen had been waiting for me to look. That was just the beginning. The next morning, I tried to shake off the events of the night before. It was just the house settling, I told myself, but deep down, I didn't believe it. As sunlight poured through the windows, the house seemed less threatening. Still, little things started to gnaw at me. I had closed the kitchen door before going to bed, but when I came downstairs it was wide open. A chair at the dining table had been pulled out slightly, just enough to notice. And then there was the smell, subtle but persistent like smoke, even though there was no fireplace or any sign of burning. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. While sipping my coffee, I scrolled through photos on my phone, ones I'd taken of the house when I first arrived. In one of them, the front of the house framed perfectly in golden hour light, there was a shadow in the upstairs window. It wasn't vague or abstract. It was human-shaped. Someone had been in the house. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it's a trick of the light, I muttered. But I knew that wasn't true. I was the only one here, or at least I thought I was. The whispers returned that evening. This time, they were louder. The once soft, unintelligible murmurs became clearer, like someone was speaking just out of earshot, daring me to come closer. I stayed frozen on the couch, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline, too scared to even breathe. And then the music started. A faint, tinny melody drifted through the air, like an old music box playing in another room. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, but completely out of place. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an old house with quirks. But every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run. Instead, I stood. Slowly, I crept toward the stairs, each step feeling like a terrible mistake. The music grew louder as I climbed, and when I reached the top, I saw it. A small wooden music box sitting in the hallway, its lid slightly ajar. I hadn't seen it there before, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My ears strained for any sound, any indication that I wasn't alone, but there was nothing, just the suffocating quiet and the overwhelming certainty that I had made a terrible mistake by coming here. I don't know what possessed me to stay. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, that this was all just my imagination. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew something was very, very wrong, and I was too paralyzed by fear to leave. That night, the house came alive. It started with the banging. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like someone knocking softly on the walls, moving from room to room. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over my head like a child. But then the temperature dropped, so sharply that I could see my breath clouding the air. Then the door slammed. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The bedroom door, which I had locked before lying down, was now wide open. Beyond it, the hallway stretched into darkness, the faint smell of smoke growing stronger with every passing second. My phone was on the nightstand. I grabbed it, desperate for light, for connection. anything to pull me out of the nightmare unfolding around me. But when I turned it on, the screen flickered and went dead, even though I had charged it fully before bed. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from downstairs. My body froze as the sound grew louder, moving steadily up the stairs. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, screaming at me to get out, to run, to do anything other than sit there and wait for whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking as I moved toward the door. My hand hovered over the edge of the frame, ready to pull it closed again when I saw it. A shadow stretched across the floor, tall and unmistakably human. But there was no one there. I slammed the door and pushed the dresser in front of it, my breaths shallow and ragged. The banging returned, louder this time, and it felt like it was coming from every direction. And then, silence. The quiet was worse. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I stayed huddled in the corner, too terrified to sleep, until the first rays of sunlight broke through the window. That morning, I knew I couldn't stay another second. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my keys, shoved my phone in my pocket, and bolted for the door. The house felt different in the daylight, quieter, almost like it was letting me go. But that uneasy silence followed me as I raced down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The front door wouldn't open. I twisted the knob furiously, yanking and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew no one would hear me out here. The windows, I'd break one if I had to. As I turned toward the living room, something caught my eye. The music box, the same one from upstairs, was sitting on the coffee table. Its lid was shut, but I could hear the faint melody playing again, taunting me. I felt the air shift behind me. Slowly, I turned, every nerve in my body screaming not to. At first, I thought the room was empty, but then I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured. It didn't move, it didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. "Please," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back, tripping over the rug. My hands scrambled for anything to defend myself, but there was nothing. Another step, and another. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, counting down the seconds. "Leave me alone," I screamed, throwing the nearest object, a vase, toward the shadow. It shattered against the wall, and for a moment, the figure vanished. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest window. Glass shattered, and I scrambled through the opening, ignoring the cuts on my hands and arms. The moment my feet hit the ground outside, I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I sped down the gravel driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There, in the upstairs window, was the shadowy figure, watching me. I drove like a maniac, tearing down the winding forest road without looking back. My mind raced just as fast, replaying everything I'd experienced. The whispers, the music box, the shadow. It felt unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the blood on my hands and the sting of the glass cuts told me otherwise. I stopped at the first gas station I found, bursting through the doors like I'd escaped a fire. The clerk gave me a strange look as I begged to use the phone. Mine was still dead, no matter how many times I tried to turn it on. When I called Airbnb's customer service, my voice was trembling so badly I could barely get the words out. "Something's wrong with that house," I said, almost shouting. "You need to take the listing down." There was a long pause on the other end before the agent spoke. "What house?" Confused, I gave them the address and the name of the host. But the agent's voice grew hesitant. "That listing hasn't been active for years," they said finally. "The owner passed away in 2019. I felt my stomach drop. "No, that's not possible. I booked it just last week." The host even left me a note. There was another pause, heavier this time. "I don't know how to explain this," the agent said, their voice uneasy. "But that house was taken off the platform after the incident. I didn't want to ask, but I had to." "What incident?" They hesitated again. "The last guest who stayed there. She never left. Her car was still in the driveway, and her belongings were inside, but she was never found." The phone slipped from my hand as the clerk's voice pulled me back to reality. "You okay, buddy?" I couldn't answer. I just stumbled out of the gas station, got back in my car, and drove. I didn't care where I was going. Anywhere was better than here. It's been months since that weekend, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that house burning in my mind. I don't know what I encountered there. If it was the spirit of the host, something darker, or maybe the house itself, but one thing is clear: I was lucky to get out alive. So, if you ever book an Airbnb, pay attention to more than just the glowing reviews. And if something feels off, trust your instincts, because not everyone who checks in checks out. Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. It started innocently enough, as these things always do. Ellie and I were scrolling through listings, hunting for an anniversary getaway that wasn't just another hotel room. We wanted something unique, something unforgettable. And then it was, a Victorian mansion, tucked away in the countryside, promising historic charm with modern comfort. The pictures were stunning, sunlight pouring into elegant rooms, antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The reviews? Glowing. 5 stars, one after another, all saying the same thing. A magical experience. Once in a lifetime, and you'll never want to leave. We booked it on the spot. The drive there was picturesque, the kind of scenery that lulls you into thinking nothing could go wrong. Rolling hills, tall trees, and a road so quiet you could hear the leaves rustle. But as we turned onto the long gravel driveway, something shifted. The air felt heavier, colder, like the house was pulling us in. The mansion loomed ahead, but it wasn't the pristine jewel from the photos. The paint was peeling, the windows were smudged with grime, and ivy snaked up the walls like it had been trying to choke the life out of the place. Ellie glanced at me, her face unreadable, and I forced a smile. "Rustic charm," I joked, though it felt more like a warning than a reassurance. Arthur, the host, was waiting for us on the porch. He was tall and wiry, with skin like crumpled paper and eyes that never quite met yours. His handshake was cold, lingering just a second too long. "Welcome," he said, his voice soft but firm, like a grandfather with secrets. "There are just a few rules to follow during your stay." Rules? That wasn't in the listing. Arthur pointed to a worn piece of paper on the hall table. "Stay only in the rooms marked safe. Don't move any mirrors. And whatever you do, keep the lights on after sunset." I laughed nervously, expecting him to join in, but he didn't. His eyes lingered on Ellie, then me, and for a moment, I swear, it felt like he was daring us to stay. As he disappeared down a side hallway, leaving us alone in the dimly lit foyer, Ellie whispered, "What kind of place needs rules like that?" And that's when it started, the faintest whisper, drifting through the house like a thread you couldn't quite grasp. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I think I already knew. We had made a mistake. Stick around until the end, and I'll tell you what I wish we had done differently before it was too late. We unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the tension. The bedroom Arthur had labeled safe was nice enough, Better than the rest of the house, at least. It was cleaner, with a large bed that looked comfortable, though the frame groaned under the slightest weight. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, curling at the edges, and the only light came from an antique lamp that flickered if you moved too fast. Still, it wasn't bad. We joked about the rules to lighten the mood. Ellie laughed and said, "Maybe it's just his way of keeping guests from breaking stuff. Mirrors must be worth something, right?" I tried to agree, but my mind kept drifting back to that third rule: keep the lights on after sunset. What was it about the dark that made the lights necessary? Dinner was quiet. The kitchen had a strange smell, damp wood and something faintly metallic, but we chalked it up to the house's age. We ate quickly, too aware of the silence pressing in from all sides. No cars outside, no hum of life anywhere, just the occasional creak of the floorboards above us, though neither of us had gone upstairs. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie and I were both on edge. She suggested we head to bed early, but as I turned off the stove, the lights flickered. Just once, but that was enough. "Generator's probably old," I said, my voice too casual. Ellie nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but something about the house felt alive. Watching, waiting. That night I couldn't sleep. Ellie had drifted off, her breathing steady, but I kept staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The lamp was on, casting just enough light to make the room feel safe. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not wind this time, not my imagination. A voice, low and hoarse, coming from the hall. It didn't say words, not ones I could understand, but it rose and fell, like someone was pacing, muttering just outside the door. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Ellie, and tiptoed to the door. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear against the wood. The whispering stopped. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, convincing myself it had to be a draft or the old pipes. But then I noticed something. A door at the end of the hallway. A door that hadn't been there before. It was slightly ajar, and from inside I could see a faint glow. Not warm like candlelight, but cold, pale, like moonlight trapped underwater. I didn't want to go closer, but my feet moved on their own. The air grew heavier with each step, thick and damp, like walking through a swamp. My fingers grazed the edge of the door, pushing it open. Inside was a mirror. Tall, cracked, and ancient. Its frame was etched with symbols I didn't recognize. But what made me freeze wasn't the mirror itself, it was my reflection. It wasn't me, not really. The figure in the glass was me in shape, in outline, but its eyes were wrong. They stared too long, too deep, and its lips curled into a grin that I hadn't made. I stumbled back, gasping, and the reflection tilted its head, as if amused. Then, slowly, its grin widened. Before I could scream, I heard Ellie's voice behind me. "Ben, what are you doing?" I turned, heart racing, to see her standing in the hallway, bleary-eyed and confused. But when I looked back at the mirror, the glow was gone. The room was empty, as if it had never been there at all. "What's wrong?" Ellie asked, her voice sharp now. I shook my head, forcing a smile. Nothing, just thought I heard something. But I couldn't shake the image of that grin, or the feeling that somewhere in this house it was still watching. The next morning, I told myself it was all a dream. Stress, maybe. Too much imagination in a creaky old house. But Ellie noticed I wasn't myself. Over coffee, she asked if I was okay, and for a second, I thought about telling her everything. The mirror, the reflection, the grin. But how do you say that out loud without sounding insane? Instead, I lied. Just a bad night's sleep. She didn't push, but I could tell she didn't believe me. We spent the day exploring the house. It seemed different. Smaller, somehow. Rooms we'd passed the night before were gone, replaced by blank walls or empty hallways that led nowhere. Ellie brushed it off as our nerves, but I saw it in her eyes. She was scared, too. In the library, we found a journal. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked, and the pages inside were filled with dense, spidery handwriting. At first, it looked like gibberish, but Ellie flipped to a page that stopped her cold. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling. The page was covered in drawings, sketches of faces, dozens of them. Each one was twisted, deformed, with hollow eyes and mouths stretched too wide. But that wasn't the worst part. "I've seen this," she whispered, pointing to a sketch of a tall, cracked mirror. The symbols on its frame were unmistakable. My stomach dropped. "Where did you see it?" Her voice was barely audible. "In my dream, last night." I wanted to tell her it wasn't a dream, but before I could, we heard it again, the whispering. Louder this time, closer. It filled the room like a swarm of bees, impossible to trace to a single source. "Ben!" Ellie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go." She didn't have to tell me twice. We ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind us. The whispering stopped the moment it clicked shut, leaving us in suffocating silence. Ellie sank onto the bed, her face pale. "What is this place?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay another night. But when I grabbed my phone to call for help, there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, no way to contact the outside world. Ellie paced the room, muttering about the car, about driving until we found somewhere safe. But as she reached for the lamp, it flickered, and then the light went out. We froze, the darkness pressing in around us. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. "Ben!" Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall. Not Arthur's. These were heavier, dragging, like something was being pulled behind them. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight and pointed it toward the door. The beam was weak, barely cutting through the dark, but it was enough to see the shadow beneath the door frame. It wasn't human. "Ellie," I whispered, grabbing her hand. "We need to move." But before we could, the whispering returned. This time, it was right outside the door. Louder and more insistent, like it knew we were there. And then, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob twisted slowly, deliberately, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was savoring the moment. Ellie's grip on my arm tightened, her nails digging in deep. For a second, neither of us could move. It was as if the air itself had turned solid, pinning us in place. Then, the door creaked open. I shone my flashlight toward the gap, my hands trembling so badly the light danced across the walls. At first, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, the same peeling wallpaper, the same suffocating silence. But then, a shadow moved. It didn't walk into view, it didn't crawl, it slid, like oil spilled across the floor, pooling and stretching until it took shape. The outline was vaguely human, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, its head cocked to one side, almost curious, as if it were studying us. And then it stepped forward. Ellie let out a muffled gasp, and I instinctively stepped in front of her, holding up the flashlight as if that pathetic beam of light could stop it. The thing paused, tilting its head again, and that's when I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth blank skin stretched tight over its skull, and yet, somehow, I could feel it watching us. "Ben," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" "I don't know," I managed to choke out. The shadow took another step, its movements jerky like a puppet on strings. As it moved, the whispering grew louder, filling the room, not from its direction, but everywhere. It was coming from the walls. I grabbed Ellie's hand and yanked her toward the bathroom. It was the only other door in the room, the only place left to hide. We slammed it shut and locked it. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Whatever that thing was, it didn't need keys. The whispering followed us, muffled but insistent, and I could hear it moving closer. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, holding my breath, and for a moment it stopped. Then came the knock. Not loud, not violent, just a soft, deliberate tap, 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 like it was asking permission to come in. Ellie was shaking, her back pressed against the far wall, clutching a towel rack like it was a weapon. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears. "What do we do?" she whispered. I had no idea. Run, fight, bargain. None of it seemed possible. None of it seemed real. And then I remembered Arthur's rules. The mirrors. There was one in the bathroom. An old oval-shaped mirror above the sink. Its silver frame tarnished with age, it was the only reflective surface we hadn't touched. I turned to Ellie. "Don't look at it," I said. "No matter what happens, don't look at the mirror." Her expression told me she didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. I took a shaky breath and stepped toward the sink, keeping my eyes on the floor, avoiding my own reflection. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the whispering returned, louder than ever. A chaotic swirl of voices crashing into one another. I risked a glance at the mirror. And there it was. In the glass, the shadow loomed behind me, its featureless face inches from my own. But it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, crammed into the mirror's edges, their blank faces pressed against the glass like they were trying to escape. And one of them looked like me. Not exactly. It was distorted, twisted, its grin stretched impossibly wide. But it was me. The lights flickered. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the mirror and smashed it against the sink. Glass shattered everywhere, the pieces scattering across the floor, and the whispering stopped. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was worse. Because when I looked down, the shards of glass weren't reflecting us anymore. They were reflecting the hallway, and something was stepping through. For a moment, all I could do was stare. The shards of broken glass littering the floor shimmered like tiny pools of water, and from their depths, the hallway we had just fled began to emerge. Only it wasn't empty anymore. Something was coming. The figures weren't like the shadowy thing that had stalked us earlier. These were clearer, more solid, and unmistakably human. Or at least, they had been. Their faces were pale, stretched like wax left too close to a flame, their eyes sunken but fixed on us. And the worst part? I recognized them. They were the faces from Arthur's journal. The sketches Ellie had found. The hollow eyes, the grotesque, twisted smiles. They were real. They were stepping out of the glass one by one, their movements slow but deliberate, like they knew they had all the time in the world. "Ellie, we have to move. Now." She didn't need convincing. Grabbing my arm, she pulled me toward the door, but as I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," I shouted, twisting harder, slamming my shoulder against the wood. Ellie spun around, her voice shaking. "It doesn't have a lock, Ben." She was right. There was no lock on the bathroom door, no deadbolt, no latch. It should have opened, but it didn't. Behind us, the whispering began again, low and insidious, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced back and saw the figures gathering, their heads tilting unnaturally, their mouths moving in unison as if they were chanting some wordless hymn. And then, one of them stepped forward. It wasn't like the others. Its face was whole, its movements smooth, almost human. Almost. "Ben," Ellie gasped, her voice trembling. I knew what she saw before she said it. The figure looked like me. My reflection from the mirror, the one with the grotesque grin, it was here, and it wasn't smiling anymore. It tilted its head, studying me with an unsettling calm. Then, in a voice that sounded almost exactly like mine, it spoke. "Give up!" Ellie screamed. I grabbed her hand and yanked her away from the door, pulling her toward the window. It was small, too narrow to fit through, but it was our only chance. The glass shattered easily under my elbow, and cold air rushed in, sharp and stinging. I turned to help Ellie climb through, but she froze, her eyes wide. "Ben!" she whispered, pointing to the floor. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. The shards of glass I had broken earlier, pieces of the mirror, were moving. Slowly, impossibly, they slid across the tiles, coming together, reforming into a single, jagged surface. And in that surface, the reflections returned. Not just the figures, not just my twisted doppelganger. It was us. Ellie and I stood in the reflection, staring back at ourselves, but something was wrong. The Ellie in the mirror wasn't trembling, wasn't afraid. She was smiling. And my reflection, it was gone. "Don't look," I said, my voice cracking. "Just don't." But it was too late. Ellie's eyes locked onto the mirror, her breath hitching as her reflected self took a step forward, pressing its hand against the glass. "Ellie, don't!" I shouted, grabbing her shoulders, trying to pull her away. Her reflected self tilted its head, just like mine had, and then it smiled wider, its lips parting to reveal teeth that weren't human. The room shook violently, the walls groaning, and the whispering became a roar. The shards glowed, blindingly bright, and I felt myself being pulled, not by hands, but by something deeper, like the house itself had come alive. "Ellie!" I screamed, reaching for her as the light swallowed us both. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the light was gone. So was the sound, the house, the whispering. At first, I thought I was dead. Everything felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat up slowly, my hands sinking into cold, damp earth. I wasn't in the bathroom anymore. I wasn't even in the house. It was a forest. Thick, dark, and endless. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches blocking out the sky. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, littered with broken glass that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Ellie!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. No answer. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ellie!" The forest swallowed my voice. Then I saw her. She was standing just ahead, her back to me, her figure almost blending into the shadows. Relief washed over me, and I staggered toward her. "Ellie, thank God. Are you okay? What happened? Where?" She turned, and my words died in my throat. It wasn't Ellie, not exactly. Her face was the same, her hair, her posture, but her eyes were wrong, empty, like they had been carved out and replaced with something darker. And her smile, it wasn't hers. "Ben," she said, her voice soft, sweet, and entirely unfamiliar. "Why did you leave me?" I took a step back, my mind racing. "You're not Ellie." Her smile widened. "Aren't I?" Behind her, the shadows moved. Slowly at first, then faster, swirling and twisting until they formed shapes. Dozens of them. The figures from the house, the faces from the journal. And at the center of them all was him. My reflection. He stepped forward, his grin calm and confident, his hollow eyes locked on mine. "You shouldn't have broken the mirror," he said, his voice echoing through the trees. "It doesn't free you, it just moves you." "Where am I?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He tilted his head, a gesture so eerily familiar it made my stomach churn. "You're home," he said simply. "You're one of us now." I shook my head, stepping back again. "No, I'm not." But even as I said it, I felt it. The weight in my chest, the pull of the shadows around me. The world blurred, the edges fraying, and when I looked down at my hands, they were changing. The skin was losing its color, turning pale, translucent. My fingers felt stiff, unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. "No!" I screamed, clutching at my arms, trying to hold on to myself. "I'm not one of you." The figures circled closer, their whispering returning, soft and relentless. My reflection stepped up to me, his grin never wavering. "You are," he said. "You always were. The house doesn't take strangers, Ben. It takes pieces of you." And when there's nothing left, he leaned in, his hollow eyes inches from mine. "You stay." I stumbled back, falling to the ground as the figures closed in, their faces blurring into a sea of emptiness. I felt the shadows wrapping around me, pulling me down, and then a faint flicker of light. The screen brightens just enough to reveal the Airbnb app. The listing for the mansion is back, but this time the host photo isn't Arthur, it's me. And beneath the listing, glowing in bold letters, 5 stars, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So, would you still book that dream getaway? Or would you listen to the whispers telling you to stay away? Remember, the next time you're scrolling through Airbnb, you might not be the guest. You might be the next piece of the house. If you've made it this far, you're one of the lucky ones. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us, what's the scariest place you've ever stayed?